There are 3 volumes inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive that have never been digitized. They were catalogued in the mid-19th century, assigned reference numbers, and then quietly removed from the general index. Researchers who have requested access since the 1970s report the same answer every time. The volumes exist, access is restricted, no reason is given. Those 3 volumes cover the years 1832 through 1837, and the central event they document is not a war, not a conclave, not a theological dispute. According to the partial index entries that survived in a secondary catalogue, they document something the official historical record insists never happened. A flood, not of water, of earth. If you have been following this channel, you already know that the mud flood is not a fringe theory invented on the internet. It is a pattern woven through city foundation records, building permit anomalies, population census gaps, and architectural surveys across Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Americas. Entire ground floors buried, windows that begin below street level, doors that open onto nothing but soil, centuries of sediment that arrived by all physical evidence not gradually but at once. The Vatican kept records of everything. That was its function for over 1,000 years. Births, deaths, land transfers, natural disasters, astronomical events, crop failures, plagues. The archive holds material going back to the 8th century. It is one of the most comprehensive documentary repositories in human history. So when 3 volumes from a specific 5-year window disappear from public access without explanation, the question is not whether something happened. The question is what they recorded that required silence. Before we go further, if this is the kind of history they do not teach in schools, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. The 1834 event sits at the centre of those 3 volumes. To understand why, you have to understand what 1834 looked like from the ground. In the official narrative, 1834 is an unremarkable year. Some political agitation in Europe, minor administrative changes in several kingdoms, no major wars, no documented natural disasters of global scale. It is, by the textbooks, a quiet year. But the physical record tells a different story. In cities across the European continent, construction surveys conducted in the 1840s and 1850s repeatedly encountered the same problem. Structures that had been built on what was considered ground level were found to be partially or fully submerged in dense sedimentary fill. Engineers trying to lay new foundations in Warsaw, Vienna, Prague, and dozens of smaller cities hit buried floors, buried courtyards, buried staircases. About it. When population shifted, the church recorded it. When buildings were lost, the church filed claims. If a mud flood struck the known world in the early 1830s, the reports would have flowed into Rome from hundreds of dioceses simultaneously. The 3 volumes, according to the secondary catalogue entry photographed by a researcher in 1987 before that catalogue was also restricted, are titled in Latin. The translation reads roughly as follows. Volume 1, Reports concerning the collapse of the lower precincts 1832 to 1834. Volume 2, Accounts of the restoration of parishes and the registration of the displaced 1834 to 1836. Volume 3, Instructions regarding the new ground, its preparation and the suppression of prior testimony 1836 to 1837. That third title is the one that changes everything. The suppression of prior testimony, written into the official title of an archival volume by the Vatican itself, not hidden in the margins, not implied, stated as the administrative purpose of the document. Whatever happened in 1834, the Church did not merely record it. The Church organized a systematic effort to ensure that what was known would not remain publicly known. This is not the first time the Vatican Archive has contained evidence of coordinated information suppression. Scholars who have worked in the accessible portions note that certain periods show patterns of what archivists call retrospective harmonization. Documents from a given event are gathered, annotated, and recontextualized within a framework that aligns with official doctrine or political interests. The raw reports, the original testimonies, the unfiltered accounts from local administrators, those are absorbed into summary volumes, and the originals are often not returned to circulation. The 1834 volumes appear to be an extreme version of that process. Not harmonization, suppression. The word used in the Latin title is not a synonym for revision or recontextualization. It is the word used in ecclesiastical Latin specifically for the silencing of testimony, the same word found in inquisitorial records when witnesses were ordered not to speak. What were people being ordered not to speak about? The mudflood community has assembled a substantial body of physical and documentary conventional sense. It was the mechanism by which a technologically and architecturally advanced global culture was buried, its cities half submerged, its population scattered, and its history rendered invisible beneath layers of reclassified sediment. If that hypothesis is correct, the Vatican would have been in a uniquely difficult position. The Church had coexisted with the prior civilization, whatever we choose to call it. Many of the grand cathedrals, basilicas, and administrative buildings attributed to centuries of Catholic construction bear architectural hallmarks that researchers increasingly argue precede the periods assigned to them. Structures built with precision and at scales that the documented construction technologies of their supposed eras cannot explain. If those buildings were inherited rather than built, if they were products of the Tartarian world and simply rechristened and reoccupied after the flood, then the Vatican sat inside a legacy it had not created and could not fully explain. Volume 1, the reports from the lower precincts, would have contained the raw testimony. Priests writing from ground level, describing what they saw. Lower floors submerged, congregations displaced, cemeteries gone, streets vanished. The sudden silence of entire communities that had been regularly reporting to Rome and then stopped. This is the closest thing to a real-time account of what the mud flood looked and felt like to the people living through it. Volume 2, the restoration accounts, would document what came next. The Church mobilizing its administrative infrastructure to manage displacement, registering survivors, reassigning parishes, the movement of people from buried cities to functioning ones. This volume would reveal the extraordinary scale of displacement required by an event that the official record says did not occur. Volume 3 is the operational document, the instructions. Someone in Rome, at the highest levels of the Church, made a decision in 1836 or 1837, a decision that the accounts gathered in the first 2 volumes could not be allowed to circulate, that a coordinated suppression effort was necessary, and that it required its own dedicated archival volume with its own administrative framework. The phrase new ground in the third title carries specific meaning in ecclesiastical Latin. It refers to land that has been reconsecrated, officially reclassified in terms of its spiritual and legal status within church administration. You consecrate new ground when old ground has been lost or contaminated. The inclusion of that phrase in the title of a volume dated 1836 to 1837, immediately following volumes documenting a catastrophic flooding event, suggests the Church was not merely managing records. It was managing the physical landscape itself, administratively reclassifying the buried world as something that had never existed. This connects to a broader pattern that researchers in the Tartarian field have documented. The period from roughly 1800 to 1870 shows an extraordinary surge in land surveys, cadastral registrations, and municipal establishment records across the Northern Hemisphere. Cities that had existed for centuries are suddenly being formally registered as if for the first time. Streets that appear in detailed architectural surveys before 1820 are re-registered under new names with new administrative histories after 1840. The paper trail of the prior world does not simply disappear. It is overwritten, methodically, with a new paper trail that positions surviving infrastructure as freshly built rather than inherited. The Vatican's Volume 3 reads as the ecclesiastical arm of that same global overwriting project. There is a detail from the 1987 catalogue photograph that has received less attention than the volume titles. In the margin of the secondary catalogue entry, written in a different hand and a different ink, is a notation that translates as flagged per concordate instruction. A concordate is a formal agreement between the Vatican and a secular government. The notation suggests that the restriction on these 3 volumes was not an internal church decision. It was made in coordination with at least one external governmental authority under a binding agreement. The notation does not specify which government. But a concordat is not an informal understanding. It is a treaty. The timing matters. The 1830s were the height of the Metternich system in Europe, the conservative political framework centered in Vienna that explicitly prioritized the suppression of destabilizing information. Austria, Prussia, and Russia were all active participants. Any one of them would have had strong reasons to formalize an agreement with the Vatican, ensuring the Church's records of the flood event remained inaccessible. The Metternich system fell in 1848. The men who ran it are gone, but the Concordat instruction remains in the margin of that catalogue entry, and the 3 volumes remain off the access list. What is the Vatican protecting at this point? The men who made the decision to suppress are dead by 2 centuries. The civilization that was buried is buried. The populations that were displaced have been absorbed into the genealogical record as founding populations of cities, whose true founding the documents would reveal. The protection is no longer of any living person or any current political arrangement. It is the protection of a version of history, a version in which the mid-19th century represents continuity rather than rupture. If the 3 volumes were opened, that version collapses, not because of a single document, but because of the aggregate. Hundreds of reports from dioceses across the world describing the same event. A coordinated administrative response to a catastrophe of global scale. Instructions for suppression written into the operational record of one of the most powerful institutions on earth. The scale of the mud flood, the scale of what was lost, the scale of what was buried, all of it documented in ink by the very institution that subsequently organized the silence. The archive was partially open to scholarly access in 1881 under Pope Leo XIII, expanded again in 1998 under John Paul II, who authorized the release of previously restricted materials relating to World War II. Researchers have made substantial progress accessing medieval documents and Renaissance-era correspondence, but certain collections remain closed, classified under a category that translates roughly as reserved for reasons of continuing relevance. 3 volumes covering 1832 to 1837. Reserved for reasons of continuing relevance. The continuing relevance is not theological, it is not political in any current sense. The relevance is architectural. The cities of Europe are still standing, the ground floors are still buried, the buildings that cannot be explained by the construction records attributed to them are still in use, still consecrated, still held by institutions whose legitimacy depends on a historical continuity that those 3 volumes would fracture. The mud flood did not erase everything. It buried it, and what was buried can still be measured, still be surveyed, still be encountered by anyone willing to go underground in the old cities and look at what the soil has swallowed. The evidence is physical, not theoretical. The Vatican volumes are not the proof of the mud flood. The buildings are the proof. The buried windows are the proof. The compressed sediment layers are the proof. The volumes would only confirm in institutional ink what the physical world already demonstrates in stone and soil. That is perhaps the most significant thing about those 3 sealed volumes. They are not needed to establish that something happened. They are needed to establish that the most powerful religious institution in Western history knew it happened, recorded it happening, and then spent at least a year organising the administrative suppression of the record. The mud flood is not a secret waiting to be uncovered. It is a wound in the landscape of every old city on earth, visible to anyone who looks below street level and asks why the architecture begins where it does, and not where logic would suggest it should. The Vatican volumes would transform that wound from physical evidence into documented institutional history, which is apparently exactly why they remain sealed. If this history matters to you, share this video with someone who has never heard of the mud flood. The more people who know these questions exist, the harder they are to keep buried.